If someone handed you divorce papers on your birthday, would you still believe the marriage was worth saving? That was the question staring back at me the morning I turned 26, posed not in words, but in a damp envelope left on my front porch, signed by the man who once promised I'd never face life alone. The porch light was still on, casting a quiet, trembling glow across the steps, as if it knew something I didn't. Or maybe it had known long before I ever let myself admit it. Inside, the house felt too still, too orderly for what had just happened. I set the envelope on the table and waited for the shock to come, but instead, there was only a strange, steady clarity settling in my chest. For months, little things hadn't added up. Late-night transactions, vague explanations, missing pieces in our finances that he brushed off with practiced ease. I'd told myself not to overthink, not to ruin the peace, not to look too closely. But birthdays do something to you. They draw a line between who you were and who you can no longer pretend to be. So I opened my laptop. I opened the folder I'd created in secret, and for the first time, I let myself follow the truth instead of his voice. What began as a single suspicious transaction unfolded into a $260,000 trail of hidden accounts, concealed assets, and a story he never expected me to discover. And as each piece fell into place, something inside me shifted, from doubt to clarity, to a strength I didn't know I had. If you want to know how a quiet woman unravels a quiet lie and rebuilds herself one truth at a time, stay with me. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The envelope was waiting for me on the front mat, the kind that already tells you what it is before you touch it. My name was written in Ryan's slanted handwriting, neat, rushed, a little too familiar. I had just turned 26 that morning. I should have been blowing out a candle or pretending to enjoy a cheap brunch somewhere. Instead, I stood barefoot at my own door, holding divorce papers that had the date of my birthday printed right above his signature. The porch light hummed faintly overhead, and for a moment it felt like the house itself was trying to warn me. I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I just breathed once, slow and full, and stepped inside, the envelope sticking cold against my palm like it had its own pulse. Inside, the thin curtains shifted in the fall draft, letting the porch light smear a soft amber streak across the living room rug. It should have been warm, but the glow only made everything look strangely empty, as if the furniture had been rearranged by a stranger with no sense of what belonged. I set the envelope on the table and stared at it for a long beat, wondering how long he'd planned it to land today of all days. My birthday. Our last shared date. The one he knew I never missed. A quiet part of me whispered that the timing wasn't an accident. It was a performance. And somewhere under that soft gold light, I felt the faintest shift inside myself. A boundary forming, sharp and silent. I opened my laptop like someone lifting the lid of a long-buried box. The folder named ledger_proof lit up in the corner of the screen, exactly where I had left it, hidden in plain sight. A quiet act of self-preservation I never thought I'd actually need. My fingers hesitated above the trackpad for just a moment before I clicked it open. Rows of screenshots, bank statements, small anomalies collected over months stared back at me. Evidence gathered not because I wanted to believe something was wrong, but because the alternative was continuing to doubt my own memory. The house was still, the night air just cold enough to feel like truth brushing against my skin. I inhaled slowly, anchoring myself in the fact that I wasn't starting from zero. I had known. The worst part was remembering all the times Ryan had told me I misread things, or that my sense of money was off. He'd say it lightly, almost tenderly, like he was doing me a favor by correcting me. "You're remembering it wrong, Em. You twist things." Every gaslit correction stitched itself into this moment now, standing between me and the man who had once laughed with me on our kitchen floor. I replayed one conversation in particular, his voice warm but edged.
"You worry too much. It wasn't that amount." Yet the numbers never lied, and the more he tried to bend them, the more they reflected who he really was. That realization didn't hurt as much as I expected. It simply clarified the air around me. The porch light flickered across the threshold, a slow pulse that landed on the damp edge of the welcome mat. The soft yellow glow stretched just far enough to touch the corner of the envelope again, like it was highlighting the beginning of a story I never asked to read. I watched the light for a moment, remembering how many nights I'd waited for it, how many times it meant Ryan was coming home late, or not at all, or not sober enough to look me in the eyes. Tonight it meant something different. It wasn't a beacon. It was a reminder, a quiet witness. And under that steady hum, I felt steadier too, even as the first crack of grief expanded through my chest. My phone buzzed on the counter, once, twice, 3 times, and then went still. No name flashed, no voicemail icon lit, just a vibration that felt like a warning or a promise. I couldn't tell which. I didn't reach for it. I let the silence settle, thick and familiar.
As if the universe were giving me 10 seconds of uninterrupted clarity before everything shifted again. The house seemed to breathe with me, the quiet stretching out deep and long. I exhaled and looked back at the envelope, at the date, at the signature that had once been the safest thing I knew. Something inside me clicked into place, not anger, not fear, just certainty. And that certainty felt like the beginning. Ryan texted me that afternoon, his message short enough to feel rehearsed. "Let's keep this clean, no drama." I stared at the words until the screen dimmed, the implication heavier than anything he actually wrote. Clean for him meant quiet compliance. Clean meant signing whatever he placed in front of me without looking too closely. I took a screenshot, my hand steady but my breath held in the space between ribs. The living room felt colder than it should have. I imagined him somewhere else, typing that message with the same casual tone he used when ordering takeout. I lowered the phone slowly, as if putting down something fragile. For the first time all day, I felt the cool edge of resolve take shape, thin but unmistakably there. I opened my laptop again, not because I wanted to, but because the silence pushed me toward it. A series of late-night transactions blinked back at me, each one timed at 11:58 p.m., each one just slightly below the threshold that would normally raise an automated flag. $297.99, repeated, familiar in its exactness, like someone tapping the same key over and over. I leaned in, scrolling through the last 3 months. There it was again. $297.99. And again. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. Patterns don't lie. People do. I sat back, letting the chair creak under the weight of the moment. This wasn't an accident or fluke. Whatever he was hiding, he'd been hiding it with practice. Grace, the forensic accountant, called me back within minutes of my message. Her voice was calm and clipped, the kind of tone that comes from years of sifting through messes people pretend are clean. "Send everything you have," she said, as if she already knew it would be more than I thought. I uploaded the screenshots, the statements, the scattered notes I'd saved in moments when my intuition had nudged me awake. While the files loaded, I paced the room, touching the back of the couch, the cold window pane, the edge of the desk, small grounding gestures. When her confirmation pinged through, a quiet sense of movement settled in me. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't spiraling. I was finally stepping onto solid ground. I saved an additional backup of every file onto the external drive I kept tucked behind the bookshelf. A habit born from anxiety, maybe, but now it felt like foresight. I clicked through each folder carefully, naming them with dates and small codes only I understood. The action steadied me, the rhythm of it almost soothing. I realized then that the fear I used to feel, the fear of being wrong, of overreacting, had shifted into something sharper. Action, not panic. Focus, not confusion. I had spent months tamping down my instincts because he told me I was remembering things incorrectly. Tonight, my memory was the one steady thing I trusted. The hum of the laptop fan filled the room, soft and insistent, mirroring the clarity building inside me. It hit me mid-scroll. 26 years old, and I was spending my birthday reviewing bank statements instead of blowing out a candle or answering well-meaning texts. I let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh. There was something profoundly sad about it, yes, but there was also a strange, unexpected steadiness rising beneath it. Birthdays were supposed to mark turning points. Maybe this one finally did. Maybe this was the year I stopped folding myself into the shape someone else preferred and started seeing things as they really were. I rested my palm on the table, feeling the cool wood under my skin. Quietly, almost like an acknowledgement, I whispered, "So be it." The risk wasn't theoretical anymore. If I was wrong, if the patterns were nothing, if the transactions were explainable, I would lose more than a marriage. I would lose the last sliver of trust he claimed I had left. But if I was right, then everything he'd tried to bury would surface with a clarity he couldn't spin. I stared at the screen, tracing the digital trail he never thought I'd follow. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. Instead, a kind of calm settled in, deep and anchored. I understood now that doubting myself had been the real danger all along, and tonight I wasn't doubting anything. Grace called again the next morning, her voice carrying the restrained excitement of someone who'd just uncovered a hinge in a locked door. "I found something," she said, and sent a screenshot before I could reply. An inactive LLC, one Ryan had mentioned once in passing, a failed idea he claimed never made money. But there it was, a secondary account linked to that LLC, not fully dormant, not fully hidden. I stared at the filing date, the registered address, the subtle trail of monthly service fees sliding quietly under his radar. My stomach dipped, not from shock but from the realization that the story I'd lived in wasn't the story he had been living at all. The distance between those two versions of our marriage stretched wide enough for secrets to grow. And clearly, they had grown. Grace's next screen share made the room tilt just a little. A chain of small purchases routed through gift card platforms and third-party wallets, each charged in amounts that looked ordinary at a glance, but together, they formed a breadcrumb trail of someone hiding exactly what they didn't want found. None of it flashy, none of it large, just precise, intentional. Like footprints left in soft ground by someone confident the rain would wash them away. I leaned closer to the screen, scanning timestamps, cross-referencing the nights he told me he was working late. My throat tightened, not with anger, but with clarity. People hide what they know is wrong, and he had hidden a lot. I opened a new spreadsheet and named it Evidence Ledger, the title clicking into place like a key turning. Row by row, I began logging each transaction, date, amount, platform, the narrative he had given me that night, and the narrative the numbers told instead. The two rarely matched. My fingers moved with purpose, slow but sure. I wasn't collecting ammunition, I was collecting truth, piece by deliberate piece. I paused once when the screen brightness dimmed, catching my reflection in the black sheen. Shoulders squared, eyes steadier than they'd been in months. It struck me then how much quieter I felt inside. Not hollow, just aligned. When Ryan called that afternoon, his voice was soft, unusually careful, as if he sensed something shifting but couldn't place it. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Face to face?" I pressed my thumb to the phone, activating the recording app with practiced ease. "About what?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He cleared his throat, hesitated, then said, Maybe us, but the hesitation gave him away. He wasn't calling to talk about us. He was calling to assess what I knew. I let him talk for a moment, each sentence filled with vague reassurances that sounded like smoke instead of substance. I agreed to meet, but only after logging the time and saving the recording. Preparation, not paranoia. That evening, the muted glow of my laptop cast half my face in light as I cross-checked another series of transactions. Something about the split light felt symbolic, like one part of me was stepping forward into the truth, while the other was stepping out of the shadow I'd lived in. My eyes moved quickly now, scanning for patterns, tracing the thin threads between accounts. The more I uncovered, the more certain I became that my instincts had been right all along. I wasn't hunting for wrongdoing. I was confirming what my body had known before my mind wanted to admit it. And the confirmation was both painful and strangely grounding. Each new data point created a rhythm, fact linking to fact, forming a quiet but undeniable structure. A story built not from emotion, but from evidence. I felt it tightening around the edges of the life we had built, reshaping everything I thought I understood. And still, there was no panic, only a clean, steady awareness rising like mist from cold ground. I saved the updated ledger, closed the laptop, and stood in the darkened room for a moment. The air felt different, clearer somehow. This wasn't a collapse, it was an unveiling. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lost inside it. Ryan arrived at the cafe with the same confident half-smile he used whenever he thought he controlled the narrative. He slid into the seat across from me, shrugged off his jacket, and launched directly into a story about his terrible luck. He told me he'd sold his old shares in a startup he once bragged about. Sold them, he said, for practically nothing. Pennies, really, he added, stirring his coffee like it bored him. His voice was soft, almost sympathetic, as though he expected me to comfort him for losing money I didn't know we had. I watched him talk, his gestures easy, his tone smooth. But underneath it, there was a brittleness he didn't notice at all. I didn't react. I just listened, letting his version hang in the air without agreeing to any of it. What he didn't know was that I had the independent valuation pulled up on my phone. The shares he'd sold for nearly zero were worth 3 times what he claimed, even at their lowest. And in a divorce, those shares wouldn't just be an anecdote in a sad luck story. They would be marital assets. As he kept talking, I scrolled slowly, letting the truth glow quietly from my palm. I nodded once, not affirming anything, just acknowledging that he'd finished his performance. He expected disbelief, maybe even pity. Instead, I felt a cold clarity settle in. The lies weren't even well built. They were just convenient, crafted for someone he assumed would never verify a thing. Cole, my attorney, sent a notice to preserve an hour later. I saw the moment Ryan opened the email. His expression tightened, jaw clenching just a fraction. He looked at me, confused and startled, as though I'd broken the unspoken rule of our marriage. Don't ask too many questions. You had your lawyer send that? He asked. His tone was thin, stretched, an attempt to sound offended rather than exposed. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. I simply said, "It's standard," and watched the realization flicker through him. He finally understood that I wasn't walking into this blind. I wasn't accepting his stories at face value anymore. He leaned back in his chair, forced a laugh, and muttered, "You're really leaning into this, aren't you? You're being dramatic." His fingers drummed lightly on the table, a habit he had when he felt cornered but wanted to appear amused. That gentle mockery, the kind he used to soften his sharper digs, didn't land the way it used to. Once it might have made me second-guess myself. Today it sounded hollow, rehearsed. I met his eyes without flinching. His smile faltered. For a brief second, I wondered if he realized the power he'd depended on, The subtle intimidation, the easy belittling, didn't belong to him anymore. Later that evening, the mediator's email arrived with the date of our first session. The notification chimed in the quiet room, the sound cutting through the stillness like a small, decisive shift. I stood at the screen door for a moment, feeling the autumn breeze press gently against it. The house smelled faintly of cooled air and old wood, grounding in a way that made my breath steady. The road ahead wasn't going to be simple, but it was going to be honest, at least on my end. I closed the door slowly, letting the weight of the day settle without sinking. When I set my keys down on the table, I held my hands still for a moment, palm open, fingers loose. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like a pause between two versions of myself. The woman who used to take his explanations as truth, and the woman who now understood the value of her own perception. The room was quiet, a kind of quiet that didn't feel lonely but clean, like something freshly cut away. I breathed once, deep and steady, and let the silence stand. The first mediation was coming, and I was ready to walk into it with both eyes open. The basement smelled of dust and old winters, the kind of cold that settles into boxes no one touches until they need to. I pulled the chain to the light, listening to its faint rattle echo through the beams above. In the far corner sat a cardboard box stamped with Ryan's handwriting, crooked, hurried, familiar in a way that made something twist inside me. I knelt and slid it toward me, brushing off a layer of dust thick enough to blur the words. Inside were receipts, invoices, and spare material logs I didn't recognize, wood planks, wiring, tools. Even at a glance, it was too much for a hobby project, the explanation he once offered when I asked where our weekends went. I sifted through the papers carefully, each sheet crackling like something that didn't want to be disturbed. Halfway through the stack, a set of serial numbers caught my eye, strings of digits that matched purchase orders Grace had flagged days earlier. I laid the documents side by side on the cold concrete, the match unmistakable. Materials bought through the dormant LLC, materials he claimed were long gone. My breath clouded in the chilly air as I kept comparing, checking handwriting, dates, supplier codes. It felt like watching a puzzle finally form a picture, one that had been sitting just out of sight, while I convinced myself I didn't need to look deeper. But there it was. Evidence he had hidden assets long before the divorce papers ever appeared at my door. I took photos of each page, aligning the edges, adjusting for the dim lighting, making sure every serial number and signature was clear. My phone clicked steadily, echoing off the concrete like a slow, deliberate metronome. I moved with a calm I didn't fully recognize until I noticed how steady my hands were. Each photo captured not just proof, but the history of choices he made in secret. The basement light cast sharp shadows across the floor, stretching the papers into long, quiet shapes. Every angle I captured added another thread to the ledger upstairs, another point of truth no one could later distort. Sitting back on my heels, I let the reality of it settle. I should have felt fury or heartbreak, something dramatic, something burning. Instead, what washed over me was a surprising, almost tender clarity. Finally, I whispered to no one, a small acknowledgement of the months I'd spent doubting myself. I traced one line item with the tip of my finger. He had spent so much energy trying to rewrite memories, yet the numbers here were unmovable. There was no argument to be had with a timestamp, no room for gaslighting in ink that never wavered. And in that basement, with the cold floor beneath me, I felt something inside align with quiet certainty. Upstairs, I compiled a clean timeline with the photos, grouping them by month, linking each receipt to the LLC account and the transactions Grace uncovered. When I sent the summary to Cole, he replied almost immediately, This changes things." His words sat on the screen like a steadying hand on my shoulder. I read them twice, letting the weight, not of victory, but of validation, settle into my chest. This wasn't about catching someone. It was about finally stepping out of the fog he'd built around me and seeing the landscape clearly. I saved the file, backed it up twice, and closed the laptop with a soft, certain exhale. Even if Ryan tried to delete every shred of data, these images now lived in more than one place. In files, in emails, in backups he didn't know existed. The truth had multiplied. It had roots. I leaned against the kitchen counter, the house quiet around me, and felt the weight of the basement proof settle in as something unshakable. No matter how the next steps unfolded, I wasn't walking into them with guesses. I was walking in with evidence. Solid, documented, undeniable. And that clarity felt like a door unlocking somewhere deep inside me, opening onto a path I was finally ready to walk. Ryan showed up to dinner carrying a bouquet that looked like it came from a gas station, bright, mismatched, and aggressively cheerful. He held it out with a strained smile, as if offering proof of effort. "Thought we should talk," he said, sliding into the booth before I could answer. He placed a folded document between us, smoothing it out with the flat of his hand. "Just something simple," he added, the words too casual to be sincere. The restaurant lighting cast a warm glow on his face, softening the edges he preferred to keep sharp. But underneath that light I could see the tension in the way he kept adjusting his watch, his shoulders too tight for the calm tone he was trying to maintain. It wasn't dinner. It was a negotiation disguised as a meal. I picked up the document and read 3 lines before setting it back down. "Full disclosure," I said, meeting his eyes. My voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It didn't need to. His jaw tightened in a way he probably hoped I wouldn't notice. "You're overthinking," he replied with that same familiar chuckle he used when brushing off uncomfortable truths. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, trying to soften the moment with a half smirk. But the performance was thin, and this time, instead of folding, I let the silence stretch between us. A quiet reminder that I was no longer the woman who accepted vague explanations wrapped in charm. He tried again, lowering his voice. "Look, we can settle this between us. No need to make it complicated." His fingers tapped lightly against the table, a nervous rhythm that betrayed his composure. He pushed the paper closer to me, the corner of it grazing my hand. I watched the movement without reacting. Once, I might have felt guilt bloom in my chest at the idea of making things difficult. But now, the only thing I felt was a steady sense of proportion. Complexity wasn't the problem. Secrecy was. I kept my hand still, letting him feel the absence of my usual concession. He didn't like it. I could see the flicker of frustration cross his face before he masked it again. In the dim light under the table, I noticed an envelope beside his foot, its edge damp, its surface slightly wrinkled, as if it had been carried around too long. It rested there like a silent witness, uninvited and revealing in ways he didn't intend. He didn't see me looking. Instead, he kept talking, softening his voice, playing at disappointment, trying to slip guilt under my skin. The old trick, the familiar weight. But tonight it didn't land. I watched him attempt to steer the conversation back to the script he thought I still followed. It struck me then how much energy it must take to balance truth and deception, when neither are spoken outright. When I returned home, I sat at my desk and typed a single line into an email to Cole. "Please issue spoliation notice." The cursor blinked once before I hit send. There was no dramatic pause, no hesitation, just a quiet, direct motion that felt like an answer to everything Ryan had tried to engineer. The night outside was cool enough to seep through the thin window pane, but the air inside felt steady. I rested my hands on the desk, palms down. grounding myself in the small truth that I hadn't let him redirect me, not even for a moment. What Ryan didn't understand, what he had never bothered to understand, was that this wasn't about resentment or revenge. It was about integrity, mine and his. He had walked into that restaurant expecting the woman he had shaped with years of subtle pressure. The one who bent, apologized, second-guessed. But she wasn't there anymore. And the version of me who did show up wasn't going to sign anything built on selective honesty. As I turned off the lights and headed toward the quiet hallway, one thing settled in me with calm, unshakable certainty. He had counted on my silence. And that was the first thing I had finally let go. Shot. Grace called just after sunrise, her voice carrying the clipped urgency of someone who'd uncovered the missing piece of a puzzle. "You need to see this," she said, sending over a grainy photo from one of the earlier screenshots I'd forwarded to her. In the reflection of a bathroom mirror, barely noticeable unless you were trained to look, was a handwritten set of words and numbers. A seed phrase. Ryan had been careless, leaving it visible behind him while taking a picture he sent months ago. Grace didn't sound triumphant, just focused, as she walked me through the implications. "He didn't secure the wallet properly," she added. I leaned against my kitchen counter, the early light filtering in dull and gray, feeling the weight of what she had found settle into the room like a quiet exhale. The link she sent next made my throat tighten. The crypto wallet showed a balance of nearly $78,000. Steady, untouched, and very much real. Transactions stretched back over months, sometimes small, sometimes significant, but always deliberate. This wasn't a forgotten account or a harmless experiment. It was a concealed asset, one he had carefully kept outside the ordinary financial records. I scrolled through the ledger with a kind of stillness I didn't fully recognize. Not shock, not betrayal, more like a confirmation that the story I'd been piecing together was not only accurate, but deeper than I'd imagined. And strangely, the clarity didn't hurt. It steadied. I opened the official counterclaim file and began adding the wallet to the financial section, typing each detail slowly, making sure I didn't miss a decimal or date. The keyboard clicks felt loud in the quiet kitchen, a mechanical heartbeat keeping time with my thoughts. I wasn't rushing, I wasn't hesitating. I was documenting, the way Grace had taught me, clean, factual, undeniable. When I finished, I read through the updated section twice, then saved it under 3 separate backups. What surprised me most wasn't the amount he'd hidden, but how calm I felt entering it into the record. Facts have weight, and this one landed with the certainty of stone. Later that afternoon, Ryan called with a tone he probably thought sounded gentle, almost wounded. "What do you want from me?" he asked, the question drawn out, meant to sound sincere. I listened for a moment, letting the silence stretch. "Transparency," I said finally. "No edge, no heat, just the truth." The line went quiet, heavy with something unspoken. Fear, maybe, or realization. Then he exhaled sharply as if the word itself had cornered him. He tried to recover with soft laughter, but it didn't reach his voice. I didn't fill the silence. I didn't soothe him. Those roles were gone now. For several seconds he didn't say anything, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than anything he'd told me in months. When he finally spoke, the strain in his voice was unmistakable. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. But underneath that line, beneath the attempt at patience, I heard something else. A shift. A recognition. He was beginning to understand that I knew more than he ever intended me to know. I could almost feel him recalibrating on the other end of the line, searching for the version of me he used to rely on. the one who would fold before he had to lie too hard. She wasn't there. After the call ended, the house settled into a deep, steady quiet, the kind that felt less like emptiness and more like alignment. I sat at my desk, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the gentle ticking of the wall clock, each sound grounding. I realized then that the balance between us had shifted, not because I wanted power, but because I finally held the truth in full. There was no drama in the moment, no triumph, just clarity, sitting cleanly in my chest, unmoved by his attempts to steer it. And as I closed the laptop, I knew he had begun to see it too. The mediation room was colder than I expected, the kind of sterile chill that made every sound seem sharper. The mediator sat with her pen poised, a soft, steady tapping that set the rhythm for the morning. "We'll begin with a provisional asset list," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. I handed over my folder, its edges neatly aligned, documents sorted in the order Cole recommended. Across from me, Ryan slouched back in his chair, arms crossed, looking like he wanted to project ease, but the twitch in his jaw told a different story. The table between us felt wider than it had ever been at home, an entire landscape built from months of hidden decisions and quiet realizations. I folded my hands, steady, composed, ready. When asked to provide his disclosures, Ryan cleared his throat, flashing a strange smile. "There's nothing unusual," he said. "I listed everything." His tone carried that old confidence, the one he used when he thought a firm voice could stand in for truth. But the moment he spoke, I sensed the mediator shift slightly in her seat. She had seen this kind of certainty before, the kind that frays under pressure. Ryan continued talking, insisting there were no additional accounts, his voice too polished, too practiced. I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to. The quiet space between his words held more truth than his statements ever did. Cole waited until Ryan finished his monologue before sliding a printed photo across the table. The seed phrase, captured in a mirror he never thought would matter. "Can you explain this?" Cole asked, his tone mild, almost gentle. Ryan stared at the image for a long second, his face draining of color before flushing hot. "That's old," he said. "It's nothing." But the room had already changed. The mediator leaned closer. The air itself seemed to pause. I watched Ryan swallow, watched the small tremor in his hand as he pushed the photo away. There was no anger in me, only the grounded awareness that truth, when spoken plainly, doesn't need volume. When our eyes met, he looked away first. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply held him in the honesty of the moment. His shoulders tightened, and the veneer of confidence slipped just enough for everyone in the room to see it. I breathed slowly, letting the stillness settle into me. I wasn't here to punish him. I was here because he had forced clarity into a corner until it could no longer stay quiet. I kept my gaze steady, the kind of steady that says, "I see you, fully." He shifted in his chair, tapping his foot, reaching for a water bottle he didn't actually drink from. The silence between us said more than either one of us attempted to. The mediator wrote something on her notepad, small, deliberate strokes, before speaking. "Your disclosure appears incomplete," she said, her tone calm but immovable. Ryan exhaled sharply, the sound somewhere between disbelief and frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Beside me, Cole remained composed, his hands folded neatly, letting the weight of the moment rest exactly where it belonged. I felt the quiet shift inside my chest again, that subtle expansion of certainty. Not victory, just alignment. The facts were finally standing in the room with their own posture, unshakable, undeniable. On our way out, the hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and autumn air drifting through the cracked window. As I stepped into the light, a thin streak brushed the edge of the ground outside. Soft, unchanged, steady. I paused for a moment, letting the cool air touch my face. The mediation had ended, but something else had begun. A turning point. Subtle but unmistakable. I tightened my grip on the folder in my hands, feeling its weight, its truth, its quiet power. Then I walked forward, the air shifting behind me, clean and calm. The storage facility sat at the edge of town, a row of metal doors washed pale by sun and time. I checked in at the front desk, signed my name, and walked down the long corridor that smelled faintly of cardboard and cold dust. When the manager unlocked Ryan's unit, the metal door groaned upward, revealing stacks of equipment I hadn't seen in years. Boxes labeled in his handwriting, crates sealed with old tape, a folded tarp thrown over something heavy and mechanical. I stepped inside slowly, letting my eyes adjust. Receipts from the basement had pointed here, but seeing the physical remnants of what he'd hidden made something in my chest tighten. There it was, the life he had lived in parallel to ours, tucked neatly into a 10 by 10 room. A clipboard on the side wall held delivery slips with Ryan's signature. Dates, drop-offs, inventory logs. I skimmed through them, counting the entries with the practiced calm I had learned over these past weeks. Technology equipment, specialized tools, components he had once claimed he didn't have time for anymore. It didn't take long to connect the dots. The items here were worth far more than I had expected, nearly $42,000 by Grace's estimate. This wasn't clutter. It was concealed value, organized with the same precision as the digital transactions he thought would never surface. Each slip I read brought another quiet confirmation that the story was bigger than he'd ever admit. I pulled out my notebook and marked each item, drawing thin red lines between the codes and the LLC records. Cross-referencing them felt almost methodical, the way one might piece together an old map. Every entry deepened the contrast between the version of Ryan I had tried to believe in and the version standing inside this cold metal box. I paused once, looking at the way the dust settled across the crates, untouched for months. Secrets age differently in silence. They harden. They gather weight. I photographed everything with a deliberate rhythm, the soft click of the camera echoing off the thin walls. Later that afternoon, Ryan's attorney reached out with a proposal, an offer to streamline the process by excluding the cryptocurrency account. To keep things amicable, the email said. I read the message twice, fingers motionless on the trackpad. Amicable had always been his preferred disguise for control. They wanted to trade omission for peace, silence for convenience. I sat back in my chair, feeling the cool edge of the kitchen counter at my spine. For a moment, I let myself register the small ache behind the proposition. Not the insult, but the familiarity of it. The assumption that I would bend for the sake of harmony. I declined the offer and requested an independent inventory, my message brief and calm. When Cole called to confirm, I could hear approval in the steadiness of his voice. "Clean is better," he said. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. Clean. Not easy. Not fast. Not smooth. Just honest. The kind of clean that doesn't leave a film behind. I sent over the photos from the storage unit, each one labeled and time-stamped. The truth had structure now. Evidence layered on evidence, each piece reinforcing the next. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of that clarity settle across my shoulders like a steadying hand. As evening fell, I stepped outside and let the cool air settle around me. The day had been long but not heavy, not the way these things used to feel. The more truth I gathered, the lighter I became, like each fact carved away a piece of old doubt I'd carried for years. I walked back to the house with steady steps, my breath visible in the fading light. Whatever Ryan and his attorney planned next, the direction was already set, not by anger, not by fear, but by evidence. And evidence, I was learning, has its own quiet momentum. The evening wind swept down the street, cool and steady, making the porch light flicker just slightly as I stepped outside. It wasn't the kind of flicker that signaled something broken, more like a soft reminder that things were shifting, settling into a new shape. I stood on the top step for a moment, feeling the quiet strength of the air around me. The light above me glowed a muted amber, steadying instead of warning, and I realized I didn't feel watched by my own home anymore. I felt held, safe. I pulled my jacket tighter around my ribs, exhaling into the crisp dusk. The past weeks had been a spiral of uncovering, documenting, confronting. Yet here, under this steady light, I felt something new. Control. Not borrowed, but earned. Back inside, I opened my laptop and drafted the subpoena for the storage facility records. Cole had given me a template, but I still rewrote it twice, making sure every line was clear and free of loopholes. When I finally pressed send at 7:42 p.m., the whoosh of the outgoing email felt like a small, clean release. I sat back in my chair and watched the cursor blink on the now empty screen. The documents we'd gathered were enough to trigger questions. The subpoena would ensure answers. I didn't feel triumphant, just settled. Like each step forward placed me more firmly inside my own life. My phone buzzed half an hour later, 5 voicemails from Ryan, each time-stamped minutes apart. I didn't listen to them. Just saved them with the same calm rhythm I'd used for everything else. Click, rename, archive. The soft vibration of the phone against the wooden counter was steady, not piercing. He had likely called from a bar, or his car, or some place where frustration draped itself over bravado. There was a time I would have rushed to call back, to soothe the tension before it turned sharp. But that time had passed so quietly I hadn't noticed until now. I didn't respond. Not with a text, not with a voicemail, not with a single syllable. The silence wasn't a strategy. It was a boundary finally recognized for what it was, mine. I placed the phone face down and let my hands rest on the counter, feeling the grain of the wood under my fingertips. My breath came slow and even, a rhythm that matched the stillness of the room. Outside, the branches brushed softly against the siding, a faint whisper through the dark. I let that be the only sound I answered. The house was quiet in a way that didn't feel empty. I sat at the kitchen table, the folder of documents open beside me, and realized that my silence wasn't avoidance, it was direction. A line drawn cleanly across the past and present. He could fill my inbox, fill my voicemail, fill the air with apologies or accusations or revisions of the truth. But I didn't have to hold any of it, not anymore. I turned the pages slowly, letting the cool paper glide beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the simple fact that I had nothing left to defend and nothing left to doubt. Night settled fully outside, soft and dark, the porch light glowing steadily through the thin curtains. The day's work was done. The documents were in motion. The path ahead had narrowed into something direct and unavoidable. I closed the folder and stood, letting the quiet stretch around me like a soft perimeter. Everything was moving toward court now, whether he accepted it or not. And standing there, with the porch light casting a steady glow across the floor, I understood something simple and profound. Truth doesn't need to be loud to change everything. Sometimes, it just needs space. Ryan sat at the long conference table, shoulders stiff beneath a neatly pressed shirt, eyes darting between Cole and the court reporter, as though the truth might rearrange itself if he stared hard enough. The deposition room felt tight, the air faintly metallic from recycled ventilation.
When asked about the shares he'd sold for almost nothing, he cleared his throat and began weaving a story about bad timing, poor market conditions, and the unpredictability of early-stage companies. His voice wavered just slightly. I watched him avoid the documents placed in front of him, watched the way his fingers tapped nervously against his knee. He tried to flash a smile, one of those half-hearted ones meant to soften the edges of dishonesty, but it barely held together. This wasn't a man confident in his truth. This was a man trying to outrun it. Cole slid an independent valuation report across the table, its crisp pages landing with a soft but undeniable finality. "This is the current assessed value," he said, his tone calm, almost gentle. The number, 120,000, stared up from the page, unmoving. Ryan blinked twice, swallowed hard, and forced a laugh that broke under its own weight. "That can't be right," he said, but the words came out thin, hollow. The valuation left no room for interpretation, no shadow wide enough for him to hide in. I watched the truth settle across his face like a slow, reluctant admission. There was no satisfaction in seeing it, just clarity, clean and cool. It happened fast. A single, unguarded sentence. "I hid it so she wouldn't get half." The reporter's fingers froze mid-typing before resuming with renewed speed. Cole didn't react, didn't flinch, just leaned back slightly in his chair,
The quiet equivalent of an exhale. Ryan's eyes widened as if he wished he could catch the words mid-air, shove them back into his mouth before they became part of the permanent record. But it was too late. The truth had slipped out. Not dramatic, not shouted, just plain. The kind of plain that rearranges everything. The room changed in that instant, the air shifting, the center of gravity moving entirely to my side of the table. I wrote one small note on the yellow legal pad in front of me. No more doubt. The pen moved slowly, deliberately, each stroke of the letters grounding and steady. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The moment he said those words, something in me clicked quietly into place. The past months of confusion, gaslighting, and second-guessing compressed into one crystal-clear point. The truth was no longer something I had to extract or justify. It had announced itself in his own voice. I tapped my pen once against the paper and closed the pad gently, as if closing a chapter I'd been stuck inside far too long. Ryan's attorney requested a break, his tone clipped, eyes avoiding mine. The room emptied in uneven footsteps and quiet sighs. I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the silence settle. The carpet smelled faintly of paper and old air conditioning, grounding in a strangely comforting way. This wasn't victory, not in the triumphant sense. It was confirmation. I gathered my notes with slow, measured motions, feeling the quiet strength spreading through my chest. No one addressed me. No one needed to. The truth had spoken loudly enough. By the time everyone returned, the landscape of the case had shifted entirely. That single admission, intentional concealment, solidified the value of the hidden assets at $260,000, a number that no longer floated in speculation but stood anchored in fact. I didn't watch Ryan re-enter the room. I didn't need to see the discomfort tightening his features or the resignation slipping into his posture. Instead, I straightened my notes, lifted my chin, and met the moment with a calm, steady breath. This wasn't the end, but it was the fulcrum, and I felt the balance finally tipping. The mediation room felt different the second time, quieter, as if the walls themselves understood that something irreversible had already been spoken. I slid the updated restitution table across the polished surface, the numbers clear, aligned and neatly totaled. $260,000 in undisclosed assets. The mediator studied the sheet, eyebrows lifting just slightly, the kind of subtle acknowledgement that carried more weight than any raised voice could. Across from me, Ryan shifted in his seat, fingers tightening around the legal pad he hadn't written a single note on. I didn't look at him. I kept my hands folded, breathing steady, letting the clarity of the figures do the speaking. Attached to the table was a second page, terms for a 24-month transparency review. Nothing punitive, nothing dramatic, just reasonable oversight for a situation defined by hidden corners. The language was crisp, each clause short, direct, unambiguous. When the mediator read the document aloud, her voice held that calm timbre of someone accustomed to conflict but appreciative of precision. "This is concise," she murmured. I nodded once. I hadn't written it to punish him. I had written it to protect myself. And hearing her read the terms felt like a kind of internal recalibration, a gentle shift toward a future no longer clouded by guesswork. Ryan's attorney leaned forward, clearing his throat with a practiced heaviness. "We'd like to request removal of the cryptocurrency portion," he said, his tone almost earnest, as if offering a reasonable compromise. I felt Ryan's eyes on me, searching for hesitation. There was none. The mediator looked between us, measuring the silence. For a brief moment, I saw the old pattern Ryan expected to activate, the one where I softened to preserve peace. But the stillness inside me didn't bend. I didn't speak yet. I just breathed and let the request sit on the table, exposed for what it was. When I finally responded, my voice was even. Any revised agreement will include a penalty clause for future non-disclosure. I didn't raise my eyes until the last word. When I did, the room shifted. The mediator straightened. Ryan's attorney blinked. And Ryan himself looked startled, caught between irritation and disbelief. But he didn't speak. He couldn't. The terms were fair. The clause was clean. Clarity comes with cost, and this time, the cost was his to carry. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in the quiet truth of it. I wasn't negotiating from fear anymore. The mediator reviewed the clause again, this time underlined by her own pen. "This is appropriate," she said, nodding once. The approval wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It felt like a door clicking gently into its frame, sealing the room with a sense of alignment. I watched her write, the soft scratch of her pen blending into the hush of the afternoon light filtering through the frosted window. Outside, the world kept moving, cars passing, leaves brushing pavement, life continuing in its ordinary rhythm. Inside, something precise and steady was forming. As the session ended, an envelope slid under the conference room's glass door, time-stamped, hand-delivered by the clerk. The mediator picked it up without comment, but the moment had a weight of its own, like a quiet signal that the case had reached its pivot. The air felt sharper, cleaner, as though the truth had found its final footing. I gathered my documents, the pages aligning with a soft tap. Walking out into the hallway, I felt a strange steadiness settle low in my chest. Not triumph, not relief, but certainty. The turning point had arrived, and I had walked into it, fully awake. The first message came from a mutual friend, someone who had floated in and out of our marriage's orbit, always leaning toward Ryan's version of events. "I heard you're going after everything," she wrote, slipping the accusation behind a veneer of concern. Greedy. That was the unspoken word. I stared at the screen, feeling the sting of it, not sharp, just familiar. People often fill silence with assumptions, and Ryan had given them a narrative easy to digest. I took a breath, letting the ache settle without swallowing me. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned the phone face down and let the room regain its quiet. Truth doesn't always win the first round in the court of public opinion, but it doesn't lose either. It just waits. I opened my laptop, gathered the documents, and prepared a public-facing summary for all involved parties. Dates, values, sources, confirmations. No commentary, no emotion, just data, lined up in clean rows. I sent the packet to the mediator, both attorneys, and the small circle of people who had been pulled into the orbit of this unraveling. As the emails went out, I felt a strange steadiness fill the room, like a quiet tide moving in. Facts don't need defense, they just need exposure. The moment the last attachment uploaded, I leaned back in my chair, letting the calm settle into my shoulders. An hour later, Ryan retaliated. Not directly to me, but through whispers passed around by people who wanted a story more than they wanted the truth. He said I was exaggerating, inventing, that I was trying to ruin him because I didn't want the marriage to end. The familiar tone of dismissal wrapped itself around every word. I read the forwarded messages once, then closed them. It didn't surprise me. This was the same script he'd used in smaller conflicts: deny, deflect, discredit. Only now, the stakes were higher, and the lie had less space to breathe. The pattern was almost comforting in its predictability. I didn't argue back. I didn't send a rebuttal. I simply forwarded the original documents again, clean, time-stamped, unaltered, to every party questioning the narrative. For reference, I wrote, nothing more. I read each email twice before sending it, making sure the tone was steady and factual. No defensiveness, no desperation, just clarity. When the last message left my inbox, I rested my hands on the edge of the desk, grounding myself in the calm that followed. Arguments grab attention, but facts endure. And endurance was exactly what this moment required. Grace called in the late afternoon. "You did the right thing," she said simply. Her voice was a soft anchor, unbothered by the noise circulating outside the truth. "Stay steady." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, feeling the reassurance land like a small, warm weight in my chest. Staying steady wasn't about being emotionless. It was about not being moved by distortions. I walked to the window, watching a single leaf drift down the sidewalk, turning slowly as it fell. There was something grounding in its quiet descent, unhurried, unbothered by who noticed. By evening, the initial sting had dulled, replaced by something quieter. Resolve, maybe, or a kind of emotional callus formed by months of being pushed, questioned, minimized. I sat at the kitchen table, the day's noise finally thinning out around me. It hurt, yes. Being cast as the problem always does. But the hurt didn't sway me. It didn't cloud the facts I had gathered, or the truth I carried. I closed the laptop, exhaled slowly, and let the room settle into a stillness that felt earned. I wasn't shaken, not anymore. The county clerk's office smelled of old carpet and ink, the kind of place where time moved slower than everywhere else. I stood in a line of people holding manila folders, notarized forms, and quiet frustrations. When it was finally my turn, I stepped to the counter and slid the additional filings across the glass. The clerk stamped each page with a heavy, echoing thud, her motions practiced and unhurried. I watched the red ink bloom across the forms, marking them as officially part of the record. The weight of the process didn't intimidate me anymore. It felt like one more necessary step toward clarity. When she handed me my copies, our eyes met briefly. She didn't smile, but she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible sign of recognition. Completing the affidavit took longer than I expected. I sat at a wooden table tucked in the corner, the kind meant for quiet reading, and signed each page with deliberate precision. The pen moved steadily across the paper, forming my name in strokes that felt firmer than they used to. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration of what I would no longer tolerate. When I finished the final signature, I placed the pages in order, aligning the edges with a soft tap. The stack looked neat, intentional, unyielding. A true record of the truth, written cleanly enough that no one could distort it later. By late afternoon, Ryan's attorney had filed a request for continuance. The email arrived with the usual legal phrasing: additional time needed, unforeseen scheduling conflict, procedural necessity. I recognized it immediately for what it was: a stall. He wanted time to reframe, to collect himself, to maybe find a new narrative that could soften the blow of the depositions. I read the request twice, then forwarded it to Cole with a single line. Thoughts? His reply came within minutes. We can agree, but with conditions. The delay didn't bother me. Delays only hid the inevitable for those afraid of it. We responded with our terms: a preservation order, ensuring no digital or physical documents could be altered, deleted, or conveniently misplaced. The language was sharp, intentionally narrow, leaving no room for interpretation. When Cole sent it over, I reviewed the draft slowly, appreciating the precision. It was protective rather than aggressive, a boundary rather than a threat. I approved it without hesitation. The idea of giving more time didn't unsettle me, not when the foundation was secure. I had learned that time only works against people who rely on secrecy. For me, it was just another steady breath. As the sun dipped low, I stepped outside, letting the cold air brush softly across my face. There was a steadiness in my body I hadn't felt in months. Not triumph, not relief, just a calm certainty. I no longer felt like someone waiting for the next blow or trying to predict which truth he would bend next. The legal path was clear, the protection in place, and the facts immovable. The quiet around me didn't feel empty, it felt earned. I wrapped my coat tighter and stood there for another moment, letting the stillness settle deeper into my bones. Back home, I placed the newly stamped documents into a clean folder reserved for verified filings only. The edges aligned perfectly, the paper cool under my fingertips. This part of the journey, procedural, meticulous, deliberate, held its own kind of power. It wasn't dramatic, but it was grounding. Each completed form, each signature, each seal, felt like another brick laid in a foundation I should have built years ago. As I closed the drawer, the soft click sounded final in a quiet, satisfying way. The legal path was locked in now. Whatever happened next, it would move forward with clarity. The storage unit inspection took place on a gray morning, the sky low and heavy with the promise of rain. I met the independent auditor at the entrance, his clipboard tucked under one arm, his expression unreadable but focused. When he rolled up the metal door, the room looked even more stark than before. Boxes stacked neatly, equipment lined up like silent witnesses waiting to be called. As he began cataloging each item, I stood near the entrance, letting the cool draft brush across my arms. The numbers added up quickly: outdated mining rigs, cables, hardware components, spare power units. Together, they formed a collection worth nearly $20,000. Hidden in plain sight, yet entirely out of the life we had lived together. Seeing it all laid out felt like watching the final veil lift. Near the back of the unit, partially tucked behind a crate, was an envelope with water damage along the edges. The paper was swollen slightly, its texture warped from moisture. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't labeled, but something about it made me pause. The auditor continued his logging, unaware of the small weight in my palm. I slid the envelope open just enough to see a stack of receipts and handwritten notes. Dates, transactions, reminders, written in Ryan's familiar scrawl. Every line inside echoed the story the rest of the evidence had been telling. This wasn't negligence or forgetfulness. It was deliberate concealment, stretched over months, maybe years. The quiet truth of it pressed into my chest like a slow exhale. I added a note to the audit log, marking the envelope and its contents, then photographed each page with the same deliberate precision that had become second nature. The auditor nodded as he reviewed my documentation. Clean records, he said. You've kept everything consistent. His voice was neutral, but there was something reassuring in the factual acknowledgement. It wasn't praise, it was recognition. I updated the financial table to include the equipment and the estimated utilities used during the concealed mining period. Each small line item, insignificant on its own, became part of a larger truth when stitched together. Evidence has its own way of organizing itself once you stop resisting it. When Ryan called later that afternoon, his voice held an edge I hadn't heard in weeks. Let's just divide the house and be done, he said, skipping past any greeting. His tone was clipped, brittle, the sound of someone trying to regain control of a narrative slipping through his fingers. I held the phone loosely, listening to the strain beneath his words. Not with everything still unclear, I replied. My voice didn't rise, it didn't waver. It simply stood where I needed it to stand. There was a pause, sharp and telling, before he exhaled heavily. The call ended without resolution, only the quiet echo of his frustration lingering in the air. That evening, as I reviewed the latest updates, the house felt calm in a way that made the hallways seem wider, the ceilings taller. I added the mining equipment to the restitution sheet, cross-checking every figure twice. There was a quiet rhythm to it. Evidence, verification, confirmation. Once, I would have second-guessed each number, worried about seeming too meticulous. Now, meticulousness felt like self-respect. When the final total synced across the files, I saved everything under a new timestamp and leaned back in my chair, letting the accuracy settle through me like a slow, steady breath. The day had been long, but the truth was fully visible now. Nothing left in shadows, nothing left to unearth. I closed the laptop and walked slowly through the house, my steps soft against the wood flooring. There was no triumph in me, no sharp satisfaction, just quiet leadership over my own life. Every decision, every piece of evidence, every boundary had led to this point where I no longer felt reactive. I felt anchored. Whatever came next, I would meet it with the same clarity that had carried me this far. And that clarity felt like the truest form of strength. I was making tea when my phone lit up with an incoming voicemail, one I hadn't heard ring for. The notification banner said, "Audio message saved," and something in my chest tightened. I pressed play, expecting a pocket dial muddle of static and muffled background noise. Instead, Ryan's voice came through, low and tense, as if whispered into a corner of a room he assumed was safe. "Hide it from her," he said, followed by a rustle of movement, then silence. 3 words, small, almost careless, but unmistakably intentional. I stood still, hand resting against the edge of the counter, feeling the weight of those words fall through the quiet house. Not anger, just confirmation. A truth he likely never meant to reveal. I forwarded the voicemail to Cole with a simple note. Received today. His response was almost immediate. We'll submit this. It seals it. The confidence in his tone wasn't sharp. It was steady, like the final click of a lock sliding into place. I replayed the recording once more, not because I doubted it, but because the clarity of it felt surreal. Ryan had tried so hard to control the narrative, to bend facts in the shapes he could live with. Yet here he was, undone, not by investigation, but by his own unguarded breath. I saved the file twice, organizing it with the same precision I'd brought to everything else. The mediator scheduled a second settlement conference that evening, her email short and direct. I added it to my calendar, then gathered the updated documents into a single folder. Each page felt heavier now, anchored by the accidental confession, proof that didn't require interpretation or debate. As I reviewed the ledger, the columns aligned cleanly, like a map of all the places truth had been forced to hide. I moved slowly, checking every figure, every note, until the entire folder felt airtight. The house around me was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater. The quiet wasn't empty, it was controlled, measured, purposeful.
I printed the newest version of the ledger, thick pages filled with dates, amounts, and cross-referenced evidence. When I placed the stack inside my bag, the weight of it felt grounding rather than burdensome. This was everything he thought I'd never pieced together. The kind of thoroughness he'd underestimated. I sat at the dining table for a moment, running my fingertips along the edge of the folder, feeling the certainty in my own preparation. No more chasing clues. No more second-guessing.
I was walking into this next meeting with a record that spoke louder than any emotion could. Later, I stepped onto the back porch, letting the cold night air wash over me. The sky was clear, the kind of crisp darkness that sharpens your breath. I thought about the voicemail, about the quiet panic in Ryan's tone, about the irony of the truth slipping out when he least intended it. I wasn't triumphant, just centered. There was no satisfaction in watching someone unravel, but there was relief in finally standing on firm ground. I wrapped my arms around myself, not out of fear, but to feel the steadiness of my own body. Inside, the house felt warm again. The recording was stored, the evidence organized, the path forward marked clearly. The options now were simple. He could sign, or we could go to court. Either way, the truth wasn't movable anymore. I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, the soft creak of the floorboards familiar under my feet. I felt calm, deeply, quietly calm, as though my life had finally clicked into alignment with the facts. And with that calm came a certainty that whatever happened next, I was ready for it. The conference room for the second settlement meeting was smaller than the first, narrow, windowless, the kind of space designed to keep conversations contained. I sat at one end of the table, the updated ledger placed neatly in front of me, its thickness unmistakable. When Ryan entered with his attorney, he avoided my gaze, settling into his chair with stiff shoulders and a restless hand tapping against his thigh. The mediator began by outlining the agenda, her voice steady, each word echoing slightly off the close walls. I listened quietly, breathing slow and even, waiting for my turn. When she finally asked me to review my position, I read aloud with a pace just deliberate enough to carry weight. There was no trembling in my voice, no rushed breath, just clarity, clean, measured, unmoved. Halfway through the review, Ryan's attorney asked to revise a particular phrase in the document, intentional hide. He tried to soften his tone, as though the request were minor, a simple legal adjustment. "We believe that wording is unnecessarily harsh," he said, folding his hands in an attempt at calm. I met his eyes and held them, then shifted my gaze toward Ryan, who sat rigid, jaw clenched. "That wording reflects the facts," I replied, my voice low but steady. The attorney swallowed, his expression tightening. For a moment, the room felt suspended, air thick with a truth no one wanted to name, but everyone knew. I offered an alternative finally. Not a concession, but a refinement. "We can replace it with not fully disclosed," I said, sliding the revised line forward. The effect was the same, the accountability unchanged. The attorney nodded reluctantly, but the look on his face revealed the truth. The adjustment wasn't a win for them. It was simply the only option left. The mediator reviewed the revised text, her pen tapping lightly as she read it twice. The shift in the room was subtle but clear. The boundaries were no longer negotiable. Ryan leaned back, exhaling through his nose, his frustration muted but visible. The mediator capped her pen and straightened the papers. "This language is acceptable," she announced. That single sentence carried a quiet finality, as though she'd clicked a latch shut. Ryan stared at the table, unmoving, while his attorney whispered something to him under his breath. The murmured words faded into the stillness. I sat with my palms resting lightly on the table, my breathing calm, my posture relaxed. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was the gentle settling of truth into its rightful place. The room didn't feel claustrophobic anymore. It felt precise, like the edges of a puzzle finally aligning. Ryan reached for the pen beside him. His hand hovered for a moment, fingers trembling just slightly before he signed the draft agreement. He refused to look up, focusing instead on the neat strokes of his own signature. I watched the ink settle into the paper, permanent and unalterable. There was no pleasure in seeing him defeated, no vindication in the tightening of his jaw, only a quiet acknowledgement of the moment, a chapter closing not with drama, but with reluctant acceptance. The mediator collected the pages and placed them in a folder, her movements efficient and calm. When the meeting concluded, we stood to leave. Ryan didn't say a word, didn't glance toward me, didn't attempt a final plea or justification. His silence was thick, almost echoing. I picked up my bag, the ledger inside it feeling lighter than it had in months. As I stepped into the hallway, the air felt wider, the ceiling higher, the tension of the narrow room dissolving behind me. This wasn't the final approval, not yet, but it was the moment everything shifted from argument to resolution. And I walked away knowing I had held the line with honesty, steadiness, and an unbroken sense of self. The courthouse was quieter than I expected, its hallways lined with muted artwork and the faint echo of measured footsteps. I sat beside Cole at a long wooden table, the soft hum of the overhead lights settling into the space like a steady breath. When the judge entered, everyone rose, then sat again in a synchronized rustle of paper and fabric. She reviewed the file for a moment before addressing me directly. "Do you understand the terms?" she asked, her tone clear but not unkind. "Yes," I replied, my voice carrying across the room in a calm, even line. I felt the weight of the past months settle not on me, but behind me, like a door closing gently as another opened. My hands remained steady in my lap, not clenched, not tense, just present. The judge continued, reading the acknowledgement. $260,000 in undisclosed assets to be recognized as marital property. Hearing the number spoken aloud in the solemn cadence of the courtroom struck something quiet inside me. It wasn't about the money. It was the validation. The truth I had followed through late nights, cold basements, storage units, and careful documentation was now written into the legal record. The judge's voice didn't waver. She stated it as fact, the same way she'd state the day's date or the case number. And that simplicity made it all the more profound. Across the table, Ryan shifted in his chair, jaw tight. He didn't look at me. When we reached the section regarding future protections, I requested one final addition. A narrow clause allowing for clawback if any further hidden accounts surfaced. Cole had drafted it cleanly, but I wanted to hear it spoken in the room. The judge reviewed the language, her eyes moving with careful deliberation. "This is reasonable," she said, adding a small notation in the margins. The sound of her pen gliding across the page felt like a line drawn in the sand. A quiet safeguard, a final boundary. The kind of protection I once would have apologized for wanting. Now it felt like simple clarity. Cole gave a subtle nod, one that held more reassurance than any long speech could have. I exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of completion. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a moment of recognition. Not from Ryan, but from a system built to measure facts, not charm. The folder in front of me felt lighter than it had all week. I watched the judge stamp each document with a firm, practiced motion. The echo of the stamp carried across the courtroom, a rhythmic series of confirmations that felt both final and strangely gentle. There was no drama here. No raised voices, just truth being placed into its rightful shape. When the judge looked toward Ryan, he avoided her eye. His shoulders seemed smaller than usual, his posture more unsure. He mumbled his acknowledgement, his voice barely audible. In another life, another version of myself, I might have felt sympathy, or at least the gravitational pull of old familiarity, but not now, not today. I watched him only for a moment, then shifted my gaze back to the documents, grounding myself in the clarity I had fought for. He wasn't an enemy, just a man unwilling to face the truth he created. The judge continued her closing remarks, the tone steady, procedural, unmistakably final. When the session ended, people began to gather their things, chairs scraping softly against the floor. I rose, smoothing the front of my coat, and gathered the papers Cole handed me. The hallway outside felt brighter, the air less heavy, as though stepping out of the courtroom meant stepping into a space finally cleared of doubt. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned, rooted in certainty, steadied by the quiet strength that had carried me from the first envelope on my doorstep to this moment of formal acknowledgement. Justice didn't erupt. It landed softly, cleanly, and as I walked toward the exit, I carried that softness with me. The first monthly statements arrived in my inbox on a quiet afternoon, sunlight pooling across the kitchen floor in a soft, pale square. I opened them one by one, bracing myself for the usual pinpricks of unease that had followed every financial document for years. But this time, each line was clean. No strange transfers, no late-night activity, no unexplained withdrawals hidden behind clever labels. Just ordinary payroll deposits, ordinary expenses, numbers resting where they were supposed to be. I scrolled slowly, almost cautiously, waiting for the familiar jolt of suspicion that never came. When I reached the end of the final statement, my shoulders loosened with a subtle but unmistakable ease. The quiet in the room held steady, as if acknowledging the shift. The recurring charges, the ones that always landed at 11:58 p.m., the ones that hummed like a coded message in the middle of the night, were gone. Not paused, not replaced, gone.
I stared at the absence for a long time, the blank space where $297.99 had once lived, repeating through the ledger like a warning. The silence of it felt almost surreal. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the stillness in my chest. It wasn't joy, exactly, more like a kind of internal clearing, a recognition that the noise he'd created in my life had finally begun to dissolve. Patterns reveal people, and so does their disappearance. I closed the statements and reached for the ledger, the physical one, thick with printed pages and documented certainty. Opening it to the final section, I added a note in the margin. All accounts clean, no anomalies detected. The pen glided easily, each stroke calm and unhurried. Then, for the first time since all this began, I closed the ledger with both hands, feeling the weight of it settle into a quiet finality. I ran my fingers along the spine, tracing the months of work preserved inside. It no longer felt like armor. It felt like a concluded chapter, solid, complete, and no longer heavy. Later, I walked to the front door and changed the lock, a small, quick task that took less than 15 minutes, but carried the weight of a personal milestone. The new key clicked cleanly, turning with a smoothness the old lock had never offered. When I stepped back onto the porch, dusk had settled, casting a faint blue glow across the yard. I tested the lock again, not out of doubt but out of satisfaction. This wasn't about keeping someone out. It was about reclaiming the place where I lived, the rooms where I breathed, the quiet corners that had once carried the residue of his comings and goings. The new lock felt symbolic, but in the most practical way. Inside, the porch light shone through the curtain in a soft, steady beam. It no longer flickered the way it had that first night, no longer felt like a distant warning. Now it felt like a gentle confirmation, a stillness I could stand under without bracing for anything. I paused in the entryway, hand resting lightly on the doorframe, watching the light stretch across the floor in a thin, unwavering line. It struck me how different it felt now, unchanged in color but transformed in meaning.
For the first time, the house felt like it belonged fully to me. I walked deeper into the quiet rooms, each step soft against the wood floor. The house held a new kind of silence. Not tense, not waiting, not bracing for what might happen next. Just present. Whole. I inhaled deeply, letting that quiet settle into my ribs. The documents were filed. The assets were confirmed. The shadows had been cleared. And I was standing here, alone. Not lonely, but anchored. I had stepped through every stage with clarity, and now, the path ahead felt open in a way it hadn't for years. I switched off the hall light, feeling the calm follow me like an old friend. The day after the confirmation, the house felt strangely weightless, as if someone had lifted a thick curtain from the air. I didn't plan anything grand, no celebration, no dramatic gesture. Instead, I stood in the kitchen with a mug of warm water, letting the quiet hum of the refrigerator fill the room. For the first time in months, maybe years, my body didn't feel braced for anything. There was a soft exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Freedom didn't announce itself with fireworks. It settled in quietly, like a room finally cleared of stale air. I wrapped both hands around the mug, feeling the heat seep into my palms, grounding me gently in the ordinary morning. Later, I walked to a small shop downtown and bought myself a porcelain cup. Simple, white, with a faint matte rim. It wasn't expensive, but it felt deliberate. A cup meant for a new phase of life. One where I chose the objects that stayed, not the ones inherited from a life built with compromise. When I held it up to the light, the smooth ceramic surface reflected a softness that made my breath slow. I didn't need a reason to buy it. I just wanted something clean, something unburdened by old memories. I carried it home, wrapped in brown paper, the weight of it feather light in my hand. At my desk, I opened a notebook and began writing a list. Not goals, not resolutions, but boundaries. 10 clear lines for how I wanted to live moving forward. No more guessing was the first. No minimizing intuition was the second. The others came slowly, each one arriving with a sense of relief rather than pressure. These weren't rules to confine me. They were reminders of how to honor myself. When I finished, I read the list twice, feeling my heartbeat steady with each point. It was the kind of clarity I'd never allowed myself before. A quiet blueprint for a life unclouded by someone else's secrecy. I turned off every alert tied to Ryan. Email filters, message notifications, shared calendar remnants. One by one, they blinked off, until my phone felt lighter in my hand. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was intentional. A doorway closing with a soft but satisfying click. For so long, my phone had been a vessel for his moods, his requests, his quiet demands for emotional labor. Now it was simply a device again. Neutral, quiet, mine. I placed it face down on the table and stepped away, letting the room breathe without the weight of old echoes. Later in the afternoon, a breeze pushed the screen door open just slightly, its hinges creaking in a way that felt familiar, but no longer foreboding. I stood in the doorway and watched the leaves shift across the yard, small gusts of autumn brushing the air. There was a peaceful ordinariness to it, a moment without layers, no decoding, no anticipatory bracing, just the house breathing with me, each sound gentle and unthreatening. I let the door swing softly against my fingertips before nudging it closed. This was what quiet felt like, when it wasn't masking tension. As evening approached, the light in the hallway turned golden, stretching across the floor in long, calm lines. I walked through the house slowly, taking in the small stillnesses, the uncluttered counters, the silent phone, the absence of tension in the walls. It was a different kind of freedom, not loud or exuberant, but steady and honest. A freedom I had built, piece by piece, through clarity and insistence. When I finally sat down on the couch with my new porcelain cup beside me, I realized something simple. The life ahead didn't need to be spectacular to be meaningful. It only needed to be mine. The message arrived on a muted evening, the sky sinking into a soft blue-gray outside my window. Ryan's text appeared without any preamble. If you had just signed earlier, none of this would have dragged on. I read it once, letting the familiar cadence wash over me. The subtle blame, the implication that the difficulties stemmed from my refusal rather than his choices. The words felt like an echo of a life I'd already stepped out of. I sat back against the couch, the room quiet around me, and allowed myself a small breath before setting the phone down. His version of events no longer had a place in my mind. They were relics, fading even as they arrived. I picked up the phone again and typed a single sentence. I signed my self-respect. The words appeared on the screen with a calm weight, honest without aggression. When I hit send, I didn't brace for his reply or anticipate his reaction. The message wasn't for him. It was a final boundary, drawn cleanly across the past. My thumb hovered for a second before I locked the screen, feeling the quiet resolve settle into my chest. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't victory. It was truth, spoken simply and without hesitation. A moment later, another notification appeared, another fragment of a conversation he was trying to continue. But instead of opening it, I pressed and held the thread until the options surfaced. Delete conversation. I tapped it without ceremony. The messages disappeared in an instant, leaving the screen blank and still. My phone felt lighter, as though a small object had been removed from its center of gravity. I placed it on the table, screen turned downward, and felt the clean ease of unburdening. The silence that followed wasn't charged. It was spacious, a room emptied of echoes. I walked into the kitchen and began preparing a simple dinner: warm broth, sliced vegetables, the soft clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl. The motions were familiar, grounding. The steam curled upward gently, filling the air with a quiet warmth that settled into the corners of the room. I ate slowly, letting the calm reach me from the inside out. There was no performance here, no tension waiting to break, just an ordinary evening held together by small, steady gestures. Afterward, I washed the dishes in slow circles, feeling the water run warm over my hands. When I opened the back door to let a bit of cool air in, the screen door eased outward with a soft creak. The breeze carried a faint scent of pine and damp leaves, drifting into the room like a quiet thread of freedom. The door brushed lightly against my shoulder as it moved, a gentle reminder of how different the house felt now. Looser, more open, no longer shaped around someone else's unpredictability. I leaned against the frame for a moment, letting the night air settle along my skin, feeling the soft rhythm of the house breathing with me instead of tightening around me. After closing the door, I walked through the dim hallway and paused, sensing the shift in the air. It wasn't celebratory or triumphant. It was simply new. A subtle, post-storm freshness that lived in the quiet corners, in the absence of tension, in the way my own thoughts moved without interruption. I stood there for a moment, hand grazing the wall, recognizing how profoundly the energy had changed. Not loud, not bright, but unmistakably different. It was the atmosphere of a life no longer shared with someone who dimmed it. And as I turned off the last light, I felt the steady calm of someone who has finally stepped beyond the storm. The morning light spilled across the porch in a soft golden wash, settling on the steps like it had been waiting there for me. I opened the door and stepped outside, feeling the cool edge of dawn against my skin. The porch light was still on, casting a pale circle over the wooden boards, a gentle, steady glow that felt more symbolic than functional now. I stood in that blended light of morning and lamplight, letting the calm seep into my breath. The world felt still, not paused but balanced. I wrapped my sweater closer around me and leaned against the railing, watching the quiet neighborhood wake slowly, each small sound softened by the early hour. Inside, I sat at my desk and opened a blank email addressed to Cole and Grace. The words came easily, without the strain or formality that had guided months of correspondence. Just a simple, sincere thank you for their patience, their clarity, their steadiness when mine wavered. I acknowledged their work, their kindness, and the grounded way they helped me reclaim something I hadn't realized I'd lost: trust in my own perception. When I pressed send, I felt the quiet satisfaction of closing a chapter with grace instead of bitterness. Not erasing the past, but placing it gently where it belonged. I printed a small card and taped it inside the front cover of the ledger, the phrase I'd carried with me through each difficult step. Truth is the gift I gave myself. The letters looked softer on paper than they had in my head, but no less true. I closed the ledger for the final time, running my hand over its cover before placing it on the highest shelf of the bookcase. Not hidden, not within reach, just put away with a sense of finality. The room felt lighter once it was off the desk, as though the weight of evidence had finally given way to the ease of understanding. With no documents to gather and no deadlines pressing in, I stepped outside again, locking the door behind me. The crisp air brushed against my cheeks as I walked down the front path, my hands free, my posture loose. I didn't carry a bag or a folder or even my phone. For once, my steps weren't directed by urgency or defense. They were simply steps, taking me into a day that didn't demand anything from me. I reached the sidewalk and paused, feeling the gentle hum of the world around me, the faint rumble of a passing car, the distant bark of a dog, the shimmer of early sunlight across the pavement. I turned back once, just long enough to see the porch light still glowing softly, its muted beam steady against the pale morning. It wasn't a warning anymore. It wasn't a reminder of anything heavy. It was simply light, gentle, warm, constant. The kind you walk toward when you're ready, and walk away from when you finally understand you don't need it to guide you anymore. The house looked peaceful, settled into a new rhythm that matched my own. I took a slow breath, letting the air fill my lungs without tension, and stepped forward. As I continued down the street, the light stayed behind me, a small, faithful glow fading with each step. I didn't look back again. I didn't need to. The path ahead felt open, wide in its simplicity, untouched by the distortions I had spent so long unraveling. There was no triumph in my stride, only steadiness, a kind of quiet liberation that didn't announce itself but lived fully in each breath. I walked with my hands in my pockets, the cool morning brushing across my face, feeling unmistakably free. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. No slammed doors, no final argument echoing down the hallway. Just a quiet morning, a steady breath, and the realization that I was finally standing in a life that belonged only to me. The documents were filed, the truth was recorded, and the weight I had carried for so long had loosened its grip. It didn't fall away all at once. It lifted, in small, patient pieces, like light returning after a long storm. I walked through the house one last time, noticing how different everything felt now. The silence wasn't tense anymore. The air wasn't waiting for something to break. Even the porch light, glowing softly through the curtain, felt like a gentle nod toward a future I could finally choose for myself. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not loud triumph, but quiet ownership. Not forgetting what happened, but no longer living inside it. If this story made you feel something, anger, hope, recognition, strength, tell me in the comments.
Your voice matters here. And if you want more stories filled with truth, resilience, and the quiet power of starting over, make sure to subscribe to the channel.